How did we arrive at the world we live in today? Was cruelty, great suffering, degradation, racial and religious division our inherent nature and destiny? Or was humanity at one time highly advanced, and then the original order of society turned upside down, after which we have been the subjects of a vast human and social engineering project, not for our best interest, but that of negative beings who wanted nothing but total power and control over everything? My name is Michelle Gibson. I have come to believe as a result of my research that there was a hostile takeover of the Earth's grid system after a deliberately caused cataclysm that resulted in a worldwide flood of mud, which wiped out most of the original civilization. I think pockets of original people existed in underground locations, as well as the beings behind this, until enough of the original infrastructure was dug out of the mud flow to restart civilization. Then the Earth was repopulated through human and social engineering, primarily beginning in the 1830s. I believe that negative beings were behind the cataclysm and hostile takeover and have executed and implemented an elaborate multi-generational plan with a negative agenda towards humanity, the creator, and creation, all of whom have been interfering on Earth, but who have managed to convince most people they don't exist. They had to do it this way because in a free will zone like Earth, the human beings who live here have to give their consent to choose whether to follow the light or the dark. The only way they can accomplish this acceptance, however, is by outright lies, deception, and duplicity, because if people knew the true agenda of these controllers, the majority of humanity would never, ever accept this. The negative beings have to tell us what they're doing to gain our consent for their actions, but they don't tell us they are telling us, and instead rely on such methods as predictive programming, in movies, TV shows, and books, etc., in order to gain our tacit consent, since we don't know they are telling us something, rather than informed consent. Predictive programming is defined as storylines or even subtle images that in retrospect seem to hint at events that actually end up happening in the real world. The parasitic and multidimensionally aware beings behind all of this want us to believe that suffering, sickness, misery, destruction, and death was and is our normal state of being, and not question what we have been taught about who we are. They are the only ones who benefit because they energetically feed on humanity's negative emotional states. At the same time, they have sucked up all the wealth of the earth for themselves. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister during World War II, was famous for the following quotes: "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." Propaganda works best when those being manipulated are confident that they are acting on their own free will. And it is the absolute right of the state to supervise the formation of public opinion. While not widely known to the general public, Operation Paperclip was a U.S. intelligence program which brought Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States following the end of the Second World War. I think humanity has been under continuous psychological warfare for a very long time. So I'm going to bring forward what has been going on in the world starting with the years between 1945 and 1960, which laid the groundwork for what was to come. The Big Three Conference in Yalta was held in February of 1945 between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin to discuss the post-war reorganization of Germany and Europe. Much was agreed to by the Big Three at the Yalta Conference, but what I want to highlight is the Declaration of Liberated Europe, the ratification of the agreement of the European Advisory Commission, and the groundwork for the United Nations. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was created by the leaders of the three nations as a promise to allow the people to create democratic institutions of their own choice and pledge the earliest possible establishment, through elections, governments responsive to the will of the people. So that is what they said. But is that what actually happened? The European Advisory Commission, or EAC, allowed each occupying power full control over its occupying zone, and the subsequent Cold War was reflected in the partition of Germany, as each occupying force could develop its zone on its own without influence from any overseeing body. With regards to the formal establishment of the United Nations in San Francisco in June of 1945, all the parties at the Yalta Conference agreed to an American plan concerning voting procedures in the Security Council, which had expanded to 5 permanent members, which were, with the inclusion of France, China, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The next Big Three wartime conference was held in Potsdam, Germany, between July 17th and August 2nd of 1945. By this time, Harry S. Truman was the U.S. president, and he was joined by Stalin and Winston Churchill until he was defeated in a British general election, and he was replaced by Clement Attlee as prime minister at the conference. Outcomes of the Potsdam Conference included, but was not limited to, the division of Germany and Austria into 4 occupation zones, with their capitals of Berlin and Vienna divided into 4 zones as well, the prevention of Nazi activity and preparation for the reconstruction of Germany into a democratic state, the decision to put Nazi war criminals on trial, war reparations to Allied countries, and the dismantling of Germany's war industry. It is important to note that during the same time period as the Potsdam Conference, the United States successfully tested the first atomic bomb on July 16th at Trinity Site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Potsdam Declaration was issued on July 26th, an ultimatum calling for the surrender of all Japanese forces, or Japan would face prompt and utter destruction. By August 5th of 1945, just a few days after the end of the Potsdam Conference, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing over 70,000 people. And the second atomic bomb was dropped on the shipbuilding center of Nagasaki on August 9th, several days later, killing around the same number of people as Hiroshima. Japan formally surrendered on August 15th of 1945, with the formal treaty signed on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd of 1945. After the August 15th surrender of Japan in 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel into 2 zones of occupation, with the Soviets administering the northern half and Americans the southern half. In 1948, as a result of Cold War tensions, the occupation zones became 2 sovereign states, Socialist North Korea and Capitalist South Korea. The beginnings of the Cold War are firmly rooted in the events of 1945. Lasting from the formulation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was called Cold because there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, but engaged instead in things like proxy wars by supporting different sides of major regional conflicts, and these proxy wars characterized warfare all over the world until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, which is considered to be the end of the Cold War by many people. Aside from nuclear arsenal development under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, said to have been intended to discourage a preemptive attack by either side and conventional military deployment, the struggle for dominance between the United States and the Soviet Union was expressed by psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, espionage, rivalry at sporting events, and the space race. Generally referred to as the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Communists gained control of mainland China in 1949, forcing the leadership of the Nationalist Republic of China to retreat to the island of Taiwan. The partition of India in 1947 divided British India into the Hindu-majority Union of India and the Muslim-majority Dominion of Pakistan, and displaced 10 to 12 million people in forced mass migrations to the newly constituted dominions, and created overwhelming refugee crises, as well as large-scale violence, thereby establishing the conditions for suspicion and hostility between these 2 countries that has existed into the present day. This movement of people started right after India's official Independence Day from Great Britain on August 15th of 1947, and this division of people from the same country and turning them against each other upon independence from their colonizers is another pattern that characterizes what has taken place here. The Korean War started in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th following clashes along the border and insurrections in the South. North Korea was supported by China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea by the United Nations, principally from the United States. The Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27th of 1953, ending the fighting, creating the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, to separate North and South Korea, and allowing for the return of prisoners. It was one of the most destructive conflicts of modern times, with around 3 million deaths due to the war, and proportionally a larger civilian death toll than either World War II or the Vietnam War. It caused the destruction of nearly all of Korea's major cities, and there were thousands of massacres on both sides. The polio vaccination of Dr. Jonas Salk was introduced in 1954 after polio epidemics ravaged Europe and the United States starting in the 1900s, causing paralysis and death for millions. We are told that already by 1957, as a result of the mass immunizations promoted by the March of Dimes, the annual number of polio cases in the United States was reduced from a peak of 58,000 cases annually to 5,600 cases. Did the vaccine really work that well, or did the pathogen just go away? Though I couldn't find a reference saying that Dr. Salk was a Freemason himself, I did find one on the Missouri Lodge of Research Facebook page, a group of Freemasons interested in the history and study of Freemasonry, that he developed the vaccine under the direction of a Freemason. The history of vaccines starts with the British physician Edward Jenner, who developed the first vaccine for smallpox, with the vaccination taking place on the first person in May of 1796. Jenner was a Freemason, becoming a Master Mason in 1802, and the Grand Master of his lodge from 1812 to 1813. The next vaccines that were routinely recommended, along with the smallpox vaccination, were developed in the early 1900s for protection against pertussis in 1914, diphtheria in 1926, and tetanus in 1938, which were combined into the DPT vaccine in 1948. More vaccines were added over the years, and by the 1980s, children received as many as 27 shots by 2 years of age and up to 6 shots in a single visit. So more and more of these vaccines were combined together. Thus, vaccines became a normal part of life, with all of us receiving goodness knows how many vaccinations over the course of our lives, starting in early childhood. The same year of 1954 that the polio vaccine was introduced, the Geneva Accords established North and South Vietnam with the 17th parallel as the dividing line, and the French agreed to remove their troops from North Vietnam. Within a year, the United States helped establish a new anti-communist government in South Vietnam and began giving it financial and military assistance. A mass migration took place after Vietnam was divided. Estimates of upwards of 3 million people left communist North Vietnam for South Vietnam, going into refugee status in their own country, and many were assisted by the United States Navy during Operation Passage to Freedom. Then in the 60s and 70s, there were many localized and regional conflicts, with proxy wars and civil wars throughout those years starting up, like in Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, and in other Southeast Asian countries, Africa, and the Middle East, to name a few. Cambodia was ruled by Pol Pot, General Secretary of the Communist Party, and his Khmer Rouge Party between 1975 and 1979, leading to the genocide of the Cambodian people, considered to be one of the bloodiest in history, in which an estimated 1.5 to 2 million deaths occurred. The overthrow of the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie took place on September 12 of 1974 in a coup initiated by Marxist-Leninist actions in the military, and marked the beginning of a 17-year-long Ethiopian civil war, which formally ended in 1991. The Iranian Revolution that took place in 1979 culminated in the overthrow of the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on February 11th of 1979, to be replaced by the Islamic Republic of Iran, with what was called a unitary theocratic republican authoritarian presidential system subject to a grand ayatollah. Then, starting in 1981, the year I graduated from high school, the action went from localized armed conflicts to all hell breaking loose all over the world, with multiple assassination attempts and assassinations, AIDS, explosions in mines, frequent plane crashes, and planes blown out of the sky by bombs, many massacres and atrocities against innocent civilian populations, regular people being blown up in discos and restaurants, and traumatically dying at theaters and sporting events, terrorist hijackings and suicide bombings, a multitude of sinking ships and train wrecks, single-shooter mass shooting events, and on and on and on. Our collective human consciousness has been continuously seeded from 1981 on with the notion that we could meet a violent, horrible death randomly at any given moment by forces beyond our control, and genocide was committed on large numbers of people in populations where there was armed conflict around the world, and that somehow all of this is normal. Has the Earth's population been experiencing a very calculated and undeclared psychological war based on terror and trauma against all of humanity for the last 40 years to bring us to what is going on against humanity in the world in which we live in today? I think so. Over the years, our consciousness has been raised about false flags, defined as operations committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on a second party. It is also interesting that from the beginning of the 1980s forward was when the personal computer and internet came into being in our lives, ultimately allowing us to instantaneously connect with each other all over the world and bypass mainstream media for news and information. Definitely a very important development for our mass awakening and a way out of tyranny and the dystopian nightmare that was planned for us.